everything went supposedly virtual, and school went virtual.
This is Victoria Bates.
I'm from a very small town, Marion, Alabama, and it's a rural area.
Like the rest of the country, COVID-19 meant Marion residents had to connect from home.
A lot of the children didn't live or don't live inside the city limit or in an area that's conducive to having proper internet services. No matter which direction you go, you'll start to experience, the internet issues.
According to the 2018 American Community Survey, 52.9% of households in Perry County do not have an internet subscription.
So now I'm homeschooling with my son, and we're in a situation where the internet service is very poor.
Since her home internet couldn't handle her son's schoolwork, Victoria drove them out to her beauty salon in order to use her business's Wi-Fi.
We were here just simply for Zoom services so he could be able to do his work.
With Alabama reopening, Victoria is beginning to see clients in her salon again. And her son did his schoolwork in the back office to try and stay safe.
And that's to keep him separate from coming in contact with my clients.
The digital divide is not a new problem, but as schools around the country close, possibly until the fall, it's definitely become a more pressing one.
Technology can and should be a great equalizer, but it's only an equalizer if it's distributed equitably.
Studies show that students suffer learning losses when they're out of school for long periods of time. It's called the summer slide. Kids can lose up to 30% of what they learned in a year. Low-income students are hit the hardest. There's basically a whole generation of children right now who are going to have a significant chunk of their education impacted by this crisis. What is that going to mean long term for these kids?
I think what you'll see more than ever is you'll see a wider spread of how kids are doing. There'll be certain kids with, amazing teachers and probably more resources at home that actually their learning might accelerate. But many kids are going to struggle. I would argue, honestly, the majority of kids might struggle here. And so either we perpetuate those inequities or we fix them.
Without the salon, school would be a lot harder for Victoria's son.
We will probably have to resort to paper packages.
But when given the option of having schools reopen,
I think that I would rather deal with the internet versus him going back to school and being exposed. There are challenges. In the middle of your Zoom, your system goes down. For him in schooling, it made it somewhat difficult or challenging.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.